In 1980, Ecuadorian police arrested a man who attempted to kidnap a local girl from a marketplace. Under questioning, Pedro Lopez confessed to the murder of 53 young girls and would later admit to being responsible for the deaths of over 110. Sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, the maximum under Ecuadorian law, he then confessed to prison authorities of having murdered an additional 240 young girls throughout Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. He was released after 16 years for good behavior and subsequently deported to Colombia, where he vanished. The newspapers referred to Lopez as the monster of the Andes, and he is considered one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October 8, 1948 in Tolmia, Colombia, as the seventh of 13 children. His mother was a prostitute who kept her children in line through the use of violence. At this time the country was in the grip of civil war, which would continue for over 10 years and became known as the La Violencia period, resulting in the deaths of over 200,000. In 1957, 8-year-old Pedro was caught by his mother sexually abusing his younger sister. He would later admit, "My mother threw me out when I was 8 after she caught me touching my sister's breasts. She took me to the edge of town, but I found my way home again." When he returned home, his mother took him on a bus journey to Bogotá, Colombia's capital city, which was more than 200 miles away from home where she left him. Alone, he was picked up by a stranger who offered him food and a bed, which he readily accepted. Instead, the older man took him to a deserted house and repeatedly sodomized him. It was after this incident, being raped over and over again, that he decided to do the same to as many young girls as possible. It is unknown when he first became a murderer, but when he was 12 he was taken in by an American family who found him begging on the streets and enrolled him into a school for orphans. But he ran away after 2 years because he was molested by a male teacher. He now lived on the streets and began to steal cars to support himself, but was arrested when he was 18 and sentenced to 3 years in a Colombian jail in 1966. Whilst he was in prison, Lopez was gang raped by 3 other prisoners. He vowed revenge and hunted them down, slitting their throats within the prison walls. He was never suspected of these murders and faced no added time to his sentence and was released in 1969. It was during this time that he allegedly began murdering young girls. He traveled between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and would stalk marketplaces where he lured away his young victims with promises of gifts and trinkets such as hand mirrors. His young victims were usually between the ages of 9 and 12 and would follow him to his secret hideaways where he had previously prepared graves. Sometimes there were bodies of earlier victims lying in the shallow pits, and there he would sexually assault and then strangle the girls. In 1978, he was captured by Ayacucho's Indians when he attempted to abduct a 9-year-old girl from their North Peruvian community. The Ayacucho's tribal laws dictated that anyone caught for such a crime would be sentenced to death, a punishment which involved being buried alive. He was beaten and stripped of his clothing by the Indians, and Lopez later recounted how, "They had placed syrup on me and were going to let me be eaten by ants." He was buried up to his neck but was saved by an American Christian missionary who came to the tribe and convinced them to hand him over to the Peruvian police. They begrudgingly accepted, and he was placed, tied up, in the back of her jeep. The Ayacucho's tribal girl and her mother. She then drove him to the Colombian border and inexplicably let him go. He would later comment, "I didn't hurt her because she was too old to attract me." He was now free to continue his murderous spree and move between his native Colombia and Ecuador. In 1979, a river overflowed near the town of Ambato in Ecuador, and the bodies of 4 girls were washed up on the riverbank. The police investigation found the young girls had been strangled with such force that with 3 of them their eyes had popped out of their sockets. The 4th girl was found with her eyes frozen open with a look of terror on her face. On March 9, 1980, Lopez was arrested by police in Ecuador for the attempted abduction of a 12-year-old girl. The mother of the girl, Carvina Pavda, observed Lopez leaving the Plaza Rosa marketplace with her 12-year-old daughter, Maria. She summoned help from other townspeople who followed Lopez and eventually apprehended him. When police arrived to take him into custody, they found him being held by a large group of people. When he was put in jail, Lopez refused to speak with police, and detectives decided to trick him into confessing. To discover if he was responsible for the murder of the girls found on the riverbank, they placed a priest, Pastor Gonzalez within his cell in prison clothes as an undercover inmate. Gonzalez told him he was jailed for R in an attempt to gain his trust. At first Lopez did not reveal anything, but slowly he began to open up to his new cellmate and began to tell him details of his crimes. For a month Gonzalez was undercover and would later reveal, "For 27 days I hardly slept, afraid I'd be strangled in my bed, but I tricked Lopez into confessing." By April 1980 he was boasting of committing murders in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru, and Gonzalez said, "It was beyond my wildest nightmares. He told me everything." He initially confessed to the murders of 110 girls but later admitted to a further 240 murders and eventually agreed to take police to some of the graves of his victims. Skeptical officers were soon under no doubt he was telling the truth when he led them to the bodies of 53 girls buried within the region of Ambato. Shackled in irons, he told police there were more graves and he offered to take them to locate more bodies. Over the next 3 months they conducted a thorough search of another 28 more sites but nothing more was found, which they attributed to the result of scavenging by predatory animals. But they now believed Lopez claims, and Major Victor Lascano, director of the Ambato prison, explained, "If someone confesses to 53 you find and hundreds more you don't, you tend to believe what he says." Director Lascano also spoke with reporters telling them, "I think his estimate of 300 is very low, because in the beginning he cooperated with us and took us each day to 3 or 4 hidden corpses. But then he tired, changed his mind, and stopped helping." Lopez under questioning. Newspapers reported in July 1980 that Lopez had led police to the shallow graves of his 53 victims in the Andean provinces of Tungurahua, Cotopaxi, Chimborazo, Pichincha, and Imbachura. The Quito newspapers were now calling him the monster of the Andes and reported he was being kept in a jail at Ambato, capital of Tungurahua province about 75 miles south of Quito, since the first week of March. A police spokesman said he was being held in Ambato until a court determines what charges are to be brought against him. Although he was originally charged with 53 murders on January 25, 1981, authorities decided to admit his detailed confession of another 110 committed in Ecuador into account, and in 1983 he was sentenced life imprisonment, which carries a maximum sentence of 20 years under Ecuadorian law. He would spend most of his time in prison in solitary confinement, rarely interacting with other prisoners or guards because of a £25,000 bounty placed on his head by the relatives of his victims. In 1992, Pedro Lopez was interviewed in Ambato by Ron Leitner, a correspondent with the National Examiner. Leitner was allowed access to Lopez in his cell to question him about the crimes he was accused of committing. However, before he would consent to be interviewed, he told the warden he had not touched a woman for almost 12 years and would only continue if he could touch the hands of his daughter. The warden accepted, and with the guards keeping their guns on Lopez through the bars, he was permitted his request. The young woman held out her hands and the monster carefully touched her wrists with the tips of his fingers, and Leitner noticed how big and strong his hands were, abnormally so. He then released her and agreed to talk to Leitner, telling him at 26 the warden's daughter was too old to interest him. He began talking about his childhood, and admitted that witnessing acts of prostitution while growing up had a disturbing effect on his mental psyche. He details the instances of rape he was subjected to and that after his jail term he began murdering young girls in Peru. "I lost my innocence at age 8, he said, so I decided to do the same to as many young girls as I could." He said that by 1978 he had killed over 100 in Peru alone when he was captured by the Ayushukos tribe and almost buried alive. He said he then moved back to Colombia and later Ecuador, where he began killing about 3 girls a week. He told Leitner, "I like the girls in Ecuador, they are more gentle and trusting, more innocent. They are not as suspicious of strangers as Colombian girls." By his best estimates he had killed 110 girls in Peru, 110 in Colombia and over 100 more in Ecuador, and would go into detail about his crimes, explaining how he would capture and kill his young victims. He said he would walk amongst the markets and search for a girl with a certain look on her face, a look of innocence and beauty. He would often choose girls who would be working alongside her mother. "I followed them, sometimes for 2 or 3 days, waiting for the moment when she was left alone. I would give her a pretty, shining trinket, then get her to leave with me for the edge of town where I had promised to give her another trinket for her mother. He gained the trust of his victims, and once he had them alone he would hold them in his arms, like a loving parent. He explained, "At the first sign of light I would get excited. I forced the girl into sex and put my hands around her throat. When the sun rose I would strangle her. It was only good if I could see her eyes." He also said he never killed any of his victims at night because he wanted to watch their last moments during daylight. "It would have been wasted in the dark. I had to watch them by daylight," he explained. He said it would take 5 to 15 minutes for the girls to die, and claimed, "I was very considerate. I would spend a long time with them making sure they were dead." Lopez said he would use a mirror to check if they were still breathing, or slit their wrists or throats to see if their blood was still pumping. If they somehow survived, he would strangle them again. "Sometimes I had to kill them all over again," he admitted. "They never screamed because they didn't expect anything would happen. They were so innocent." He also propped some of his victims up in their graves and spoke to them during bizarre and gruesome gatherings he liked to call tea parties. "My little friends like to have company. I often put 3 or 4 girls in a single hole and talk to them. It was like having a party. But after a while, because they couldn't move, I got bored and went out looking for new girls." He explained why he only chose very young girls, saying it's like eating chicken. Why eat old chicken when you can have young chicken? Lopez revealed he had wanted to essay and kill the young daughters of foreign tourists. "I often followed tourist families, wanting to take their beautiful blonde daughters. But I never got the chance. Their parents were too watchful." Pedro Lopez during his imprisonment. He explained to Leitner about the moment of death. "There is a wonderful moment, a divine moment when I have my hands around a young girl's throat. I look into her eyes and see a certain light, a spark, suddenly go out. Only those who kill know what I mean." He continued, "The moment of death is enthralling and exciting. Someday, when I am released, I will feel that moment again. I will be happy to kill again. It is my mission." He laughingly commented about his freedom, saying he was being released for good behavior and described himself as the man of the century. "I will soon be a free man again," said Lopez. "They are releasing me on good behavior in 1998 or 1999. For much of his captivity he feared he would be extradited to his native Colombia, where he would have faced a firing squad in a country with a death penalty. After serving 16 years of his 20-year life sentence, 51-year-old Pedro Lopez was released. He had previously been moved to solitary cell 29 in Penal Garcia de Moreno in Quito, and on January 1, 1999, just after midnight on New Year's Eve, he was taken from his cell under heavy guard. He was handcuffed and taken in a police van followed by 2 escort vehicles for protection against possible retaliation from his victims' families and driven to the Colombian border. There he was given a new shirt, shoes, a bottle of water, package of food and a small amount of Colombian pesos and set loose. The Ecuadorian government explained they were deporting him because he had no visa to stay in Ecuador. Major Lascano, governor of Ambato jail where Lopez was held for most of his sentence before his transfer to Quito, spoke about his release. "God save the children. He is unreformed and totally remorseless. This whole nightmare may start again." After this, Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes, disappeared. Families in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru who heard about his freedom were fearful of their children falling victim to the serial killer, and there were numerous sightings of him with citizens calling police to ensure Lopez was recaptured. Jose Rivas, the commander of the Carchi police in Ecuador, said Lopez was seen in the mountains between Ecuador and Colombia. Minister of Prisons Pablo Fagaro was questioned by reporters about Lopez's release and admitted, "Yes, it does sound strange, but that is our law." The law of no executions or sentences longer than 20 years was passed over 100 years ago to protect presidents of Ecuador from being killed following revolutions and military coups. In the past they had been executed in horrific ways, like being pulled apart by 4 horses. The law seemed humane. The whereabouts of Pedro Lopez after his release are unknown, and there are reports he is currently imprisoned whilst others state that he is a free man.